The altar was already stained when they brought him in. They had chosen him because he wouldn't fight back. His name was Kale, and 3 days ago he had saved every single one of them. He had held the mountain pass alone for 6 hours while the village ran. When they found him still standing at dawn, they carried him back like a hero. Then the elder called a meeting no one invited Kale to. The Demon King wanted one soul of exceptional power in exchange for sparing the rest. Kale was exceptional, already half dead, and had no family left to object. The elder came to tell him personally, which felt like a strange courtesy for something so completely without it. Kale didn't beg, because he could see from their faces it was already decided. They moved him to the altar before sunrise so the village wouldn't have to watch. The Demon King arrived exactly on time, which said something about what kind of creature kept its word. He was enormous, ancient, draped in shadow that moved against the wind. He looked at Kale on the altar the way you look at a meal you've been promised. The elder stood behind the Demon King, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. 3 of the men who had carried Kale back from the pass were standing in the crowd. None of them looked at him. The ritual took less than a minute. The last thing Kale saw was the sky above the altar, pale gray and indifferent. The last thing he felt was the Demon King's power entering his chest like a fist through water. The last thing he heard was the elder exhaling with relief. And then there was nothing. 3 days before the altar, Kale had been the most capable fighter in 3 provinces. He had never asked for the title and never used it to take anything. He had grown up in the village, trained alone in the hills, and come back every time they needed him. The Demon King's army had appeared at the mountain pass on a Tuesday with no warning. The village had an evacuation plan that required someone to hold the pass for at least 4 hours. No one volunteered. Kale picked up his sword and walked to the pass without saying anything to anyone. He held it for 6 hours and 17 minutes. He killed 43 of the Demon King soldiers and wounded another 60 before they stopped coming. He did this alone, with 2 broken ribs from the 2nd hour and a deep cut on his left arm from the 4th. When the last soldier retreated and the pass went quiet, he sat down on a rock and waited for the village to come back. They did come back and they did celebrate, and for 2 days everything was exactly what it looked like. On the 3rd day the elder received a message from the Demon King's court. The message was simple: one exceptional soul or the army returns, this time without stopping. The elder assembled the council that evening and they discussed it for 2 hours. Kale was the only person in the village who qualified as exceptional by any measurement. He was also, conveniently, already injured. The council voted 7-1. No one recorded who voted which way. No one came to tell Kale until the decision was final. The darkness after death was not what he expected. It was not empty, it was full, dense, pressing against him from all sides like deep water. He was aware of himself despite having no body, which was its own kind of disorienting. Something was moving in the darkness around him, circling slowly. It was enormous and it was patient and it did not feel like the Demon King. It felt much older than the Demon King. It spoke without sound, the meaning arriving directly rather than through any language. It told him that he had been consumed by something that had no right to consume him. It told him that this created an imbalance that needed correcting. It told him he was being returned. Kale asked what he would be returned as. There was a long pause before the answer came. The answer was that he would be returned as whatever the thing that consumed him had made him. He asked if that was dangerous. The pause this time was shorter, and the answer felt almost like amusement. It told him that dangerous was one word for it. The darkness contracted around him like a fist closing. Then it released all at once, and the world came back in a single overwhelming rush of sensation. He woke up face down in the dirt at the base of the altar. The altar was cold and the sky above it was full dark. Hours passed when the ritual had happened. He lay still for a long time, taking inventory of what he was. His ribs were healed. His arm was healed. Everything was healed, and something was also very different, and he was not yet sure what to call it. He stood up slowly and looked at his hands in the dark. They looked the same. He could feel the village from where he stood, every heartbeat in it, every breath, every person still awake. He could feel the elder's heartbeat specifically, slightly faster than the others, still carrying the residue of relief. He stood at the base of the altar for a long time without moving. He was not angry. He was something that had no name yet, and he understood instinctively that this was more dangerous than angry. He did not go back to the village that night. He walked into the hills where he used to train and sat down on a flat rock and thought until dawn. By the time the sun came up he had made exactly one decision. He was not going to do anything immediately. He was going to watch and wait and understand the full shape of what had been done before he moved at all. He found an empty shepherd's hut 2 hills over and made it livable in a single afternoon. He needed very little sleep now, which gave him long quiet hours to learn what he had become. The power the Demon King had left inside him was not something he could describe in simple terms. It was not strength, exactly, though he was stronger. It was more like authority, the ability to make things happen simply by deciding they would. He tested it carefully, alone, the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it. He could move without sound when he chose to. He could make himself unnoticeable in a crowd, not invisible, just easy to look past. He could feel deception the way other people feel heat, a warmth that intensified near lies. He spent 2 weeks in the shepherd's hut learning the edges of what he was. Then he walked back to the village and got a job. The job was fixing fences for a farmer on the eastern edge of the village. It was below anything he had ever done and it was perfect. No one looked twice at a fence mender. No one told the fence mender things they were careful about saying in front of important people. He listened to everything and said almost nothing and learned more in 2 weeks than he had in 2 years. The elder had already told the village that the sacrifice had been successful. He had framed it as a sad necessity and a collective decision made for the good of all. Several people were grieving Kale in ways that appeared genuine. Several others had moved on with the particular speed of people who had been waiting for permission. The elder himself had given a small speech at what was described as a memorial gathering. He had spoken of sacrifice and duty and the hard choices that leadership required. The applause had been warm. Elder Sovun had governed this village for 22 years and he was very good at it. He was the kind of leader who made hard decisions look easy and easy decisions look hard. He remembered names, attended funerals, and kept meticulous records of every favor he had ever done for anyone. He had not invented the practice of sacrifice. It had been used twice before in the province's history. He had simply been the first to find it convenient rather than tragic. After the Kale situation resolved cleanly, his reputation in the village actually improved. He had made the hard call, the village had survived, and now people spoke of his steadiness under pressure. 3 neighboring villages sent representatives to learn how he had negotiated with the Demon King's court. He received them graciously and explained that it required a certain kind of pragmatism most leaders found difficult. He began using the word pragmatism a great deal. He had a gift for making terrible things sound like wisdom. The Demon King's court sent a formal letter of acknowledgement 2 weeks after the ritual. It praised the village's cooperation and suggested that future arrangements could be mutually beneficial. The elder read this letter several times and then locked it in the strongbox under his desk. He did not share it with the council. He began replying to the court's messages privately, which was a new development. None of this was visible to anyone in the village. From the outside he was exactly what he had always appeared to be, a steady, pragmatic, deeply respected leader. He walked through the market every morning and greeted people by name. He remembered which families had lost members in the evacuation and asked after them specifically. He was very good at the performance of care. The fence mender on the eastern edge watched all of this without expression. The first thing to go wrong for the elder was a letter. Not the letter from the Demon King's court, a different one, a local one, addressed to the council. It raised questions about the ritual decision, specifically who had voted which way and why no record existed. The elder addressed it smoothly at the next council meeting, citing the emotional difficulty of the moment. The council accepted this explanation and moved on. The second thing was a conversation between 2 of the fence mender's neighboring farmers. One of them mentioned, casually, that he thought someone had been watching the elder's house at night. The fence mender expressed mild interest and asked a few questions that sounded like idle curiosity. The third thing was a record. The village kept records of all formal decisions, and the sacrifice decision was logged as unanimous. It had not been unanimous. The vote was 7-1. Someone had changed the record, and the change was recent, and it had been done carefully. Not carefully enough. The fence mender found the original notation underneath the correction, barely visible under the new ink. He did not report this to anyone. He simply remembered it with the specific precision he now applied to everything. The fourth thing was a name. The Demon King's court correspondence mentioned, in passing, a previous arrangement with this village. Not the most recent one, an earlier one from 4 years ago. 4 years ago a young man named Darrow had disappeared while traveling between villages. His family had been told he was lost in the hills. His name appeared in the Demon King's court records as a successful delivery. The fence mender sat with this information for 3 days before doing anything with it. Then he visited Darrow's mother, who was elderly and lived alone on the north side of the village. He brought vegetables from the farmer he worked for and stayed for tea. She talked about Darrow for a long time without being asked. He listened to all of it and said almost nothing. When he left, she stood at her door watching him walk away with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something about the fence mender felt familiar in a way she couldn't place. She went inside and thought about it for the rest of the evening. The elders saw the fence mender for the first time at the autumn market. He noticed him the way he noticed everything, with a brief, cataloging attention. Something about the man registered as slightly wrong, though he couldn't say what. He filed it away and went back to his conversation. 2 days later he saw him again, at the edge of the square during a council announcement. The fence mender was not watching the elder. He was watching the crowd's reaction to the elder, which was a different and more unsettling thing. The elder mentioned this to his assistant that evening and asked for information on recent arrivals. The fence mender's name came back as a traveler passing through, hired temporarily by the eastern farmer. No outstanding details, no connection to anything significant. The elder accepted this and told himself he was being cautious. He was, but not cautious enough and not about the right things. 3 days after that, the fence mender knocked on the elder's door in the middle of the afternoon. He was carrying a small package of vegetables from the farmer, a gift for the elder's household. The elder received him in the front room, standing, which was how he received people he had not decided were important. The fence mender handed over the vegetables and said very little. He commented on the weather, asked after the council's upcoming decisions, and made one observation. He said he had heard the village had faced some difficulty the previous season and handled it admirably. The elder said that was true and that leadership in difficult times required clear thinking. The fence mender agreed that it did. He said he imagined it was hard to make decisions that affected everyone, especially irreversible ones. The elder said that was the nature of leadership. The fence mender nodded, thanked him for his time, and left. The elder stood in his front room for a long time after the door closed. He could not identify a single thing wrong with the conversation. That was the problem. The letter arrived at the council the following week. It was not from the fence mender. It was from the province's central authority, accompanied by a sealed inquiry notice. The inquiry concerned the disappearance of a young man named Darrow 4 years earlier. It also concerned recent communications between this village and the Demon King's court. Specifically, it concerned a series of private letters that someone had obtained copies of. The elder read the inquiry notice twice and then sat very still at his desk. The council convened that evening and the atmosphere was nothing like their usual meetings. The letter described a pattern, not one sacrifice, not one terrible decision, but a practice. A practice of identifying expendable individuals and offering them privately to the Demon King's court. A practice that the elder had apparently been refining for years. The council member who had cast the one dissenting vote said nothing for the entire meeting. She didn't need to. The elder attempted to frame it as complexity, as nuance, as the kind of thing that looked different from the inside. The council listened to all of it with expressions that told him exactly how it was landing. By the end of the week, the provincial authority had sent investigators. They arrived with the private letters, authenticated copies of the court records, and a witness. The witness was Darrow's mother, who had remembered, 3 days after tea with the fence mender, exactly who he reminded her of. She had gone to the provincial authority herself. The elder was formally removed from his position on a Thursday morning in the village square. The same square where he had given his speech about sacrifice and duty and pragmatic leadership. A significant portion of the village was present. Several of the people who had applauded that speech were standing in the same spots they had stood then. The elder said nothing during the removal. He had run out of framings. Cale was not in the square when it happened. He heard about it from the eastern farmer at the end of the workday. He nodded, finished stacking the last of the fence posts, and walked back to the shepherd's hut. He sat outside as the light faded and looked at the hills where he used to train. The power inside him sat quietly, the way it always did when there was nothing left to do. He thought about the elder standing in the square with nothing left to say. He thought about Darrow, who had been lost in the hills and was still lost, just accurately so now. He thought about his own name in the provincial records, still listed under the ritual as a successful delivery. That would need to be corrected eventually. He was not in a hurry. He had learned, in the shepherd's hut, in the hills, in the long quiet hours between what he used to be and what he was now, that patience was not the same thing as waiting. Patience was knowing exactly when to move and being comfortable with everything that came before it. The village still didn't know he was alive. Most of them didn't know the fence mender's name. That was fine. He stood up, went inside, and made something to eat. Tomorrow there would be more fences and more conversations and more of the slow, careful work of understanding a world that had decided he was expendable. He had time. He had considerably more than time. He was, as the thing in the darkness had said, something worse than what had consumed him. He just hadn't decided yet what to do with that. The provincial investigators left after 2 weeks and took the elder with them. The village spent the following month the way communities spend time after something like that. Quietly, carefully, avoiding certain conversations. A temporary council was appointed and immediately began arguing about everything. The fence mender kept fixing fences. He had learned something important about staying in a place after a thing like this. The people who disappeared right after looked guilty. The people who stayed and kept working looked like furniture. He had been furniture for 3 months now and it was working exactly as intended. On a Wednesday morning a rider arrived from the Demon King's court. He was dressed in formal court colors, black and deep gold, and he carried a sealed message. The message was addressed to the village elder, who no longer existed in that capacity. The temporary council received it and spent the better part of a day deciding what to do with it. They eventually opened it. The message was a polite inquiry about the delay in expected correspondence. It referenced, without specifics, ongoing arrangements that required regular maintenance. The council had no idea what arrangements it meant. 3 of them had been on the original council that voted 7-1. None of them said this out loud. They sent a vague reply saying there had been leadership transitions and thanked the court for its patience. The fence mender heard about this from the farmer, who heard it from his wife, who heard it at the market. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he began paying attention to the court rider's patterns. The rider came once a month, always on a Wednesday, always from the Eastern Road. He stayed one night at the village's only inn and left the following morning. He never spoke to anyone except the innkeeper and whoever received the correspondence. He ate alone, drank moderately, and kept his saddlebags locked. He was very ordinary for someone from the Demon King's court. That was its own kind of information. The court sent ordinary people to ordinary villages because ordinary villages were not considered threats. Kale followed the rider on his next departure, staying far enough back to be a smudge on the Eastern Road. He followed him for 4 hours until the road entered the forest at the province's eastern boundary. He didn't need to follow him further. He had learned what he needed: the route, the timing, the rhythm. He went back to the shepherd's hut and thought for a long time about the Demon King. Not about revenge, not about justice, not about any of the loud satisfying things. About architecture. The elder had been one piece of an arrangement, not the whole arrangement. The court had been running this kind of deal with villages across the province for years. Every deal required willing participants on the village side. Every willing participant was someone who had decided that someone else's life was acceptable currency. There were more of them in more villages, and the court knew all their names. That was the actual problem. Not the Demon King specifically. The system the Demon King had built that made ordinary people into acceptable monsters. He found her on a market day, 6 weeks after the elder's removal. Her name was Sarah and she was a record keeper for the provincial authority. She had been sent to the village to catalog the investigation's findings and had stayed longer than expected. She was small, precise, and had the expression of someone who found most people slightly disappointing. He recognized the type immediately, the kind of person who noticed things and kept the noticing to themselves. He had been exactly that person before the altar. He sat near her at the market food stall and ordered the same thing she was eating. She did not look up from her records. He said, without any particular tone, that he had found a second name in the Darrow correspondence. She looked up. He told her the name was from a village 3 days east, about 18 months before Darrow. She asked how he had found it. He said he had been paying attention. She studied him for a long moment with the precise evaluating look of someone adding numbers in their head. She asked who he was. He said he was the fence mender, and that the name was Fun, and that Fun's family still lived 3 days east. She wrote the name down without breaking eye contact, which he found professionally impressive. She said she would look into it. He said he thought she would, and went back to his food. She watched him leave with the same expression Darrow's mother had used. Something familiar she couldn't place. The Demon King's court noticed the elder's silence before the provincial authorities' reply arrived. Courts that ran operations like this were very sensitive to silence. A second rider arrived, this one more senior, wearing different insignia. He did not go to the inn. He went directly to the temporary council and asked, in precise formal language, what had happened to the previous administration. The council told him about the provincial investigation. His expression did not change, which was more alarming than if it had. He left the same afternoon without sending any correspondence. That was the first time Kale felt something shift in the weight of the situation. A court that stopped sending letters was a court that had started doing something else instead. He went to the shepherd's hut and spent the night thinking through the shape of what came next. By morning he had identified 3 possibilities. The court would cut the village loose and find a new supplier. The court would send someone to clean up the existing exposure. The court would do both in that order. He decided to act before the second option arrived. He traveled east for 3 days and found Finn's family. They lived in a small house at the edge of a village very similar to his own. Finn's father was a farmer, weathered, quiet, with the specific stillness of someone who had stopped expecting answers. Kale sat with him for an afternoon and said almost nothing. He didn't need to explain anything. He just needed the man to know that someone had found Finn's name. He left the following morning and sent a letter to Sarah's provincial office before he reached home. The letter contained Finn's father's name, his village, and the date Finn had disappeared. It also contained the name of a third village, further east, where Kale had found a third pattern. He had not been to the third village yet. He included enough detail that Sarah could verify it independently. He signed the letter with no name, which he suspected she would appreciate. He was right. Sarah received the letter on a Thursday and left for the eastern villages the following morning. She did not file the investigation as complete before she left. She filed it as ongoing, with a note that significant additional findings were expected. The provincial authority accepted this and expanded the inquiry's jurisdiction accordingly. It now covered the eastern corridor, which included 7 villages and the road to the Demon King's territorial boundary. This was significant. This made it harder for the court to clean up quietly. The cleaner arrived in the village on a Tuesday, 2 days ahead of the regular Wednesday rider. He was not wearing court colors. He was dressed as a traveling merchant, which was a reasonable cover for the eastern road. He carried genuine merchant goods and had a genuine merchant's easy manner. He was also carrying something in his left boot that was not merchant-related. Kale felt him arrive the way he felt everything now, as information, as weight, as a specific kind of intention. He recognized the intention immediately. It was the intention of someone who had come to make a problem disappear. He watched the cleaner check into the inn and spend the afternoon being visibly ordinary. He had dinner with 2 farmers, complimented the village, asked interested questions about the local economy. He was very good. He was also not as good as someone who had died on an altar and come back as something the Demon King hadn't intended to create. Kale sat on a hill above the village that evening and thought about what he wanted to happen next. Not what he could do, he knew what he could do. What he wanted. He wanted the cleaner to go back to the court and report that the village was already a lost cause. He wanted the court to understand that this particular operation had become too expensive to continue. He wanted the system to feel, for the first time, like it was costing more than it was gaining. He went down the hill and knocked on the inside door. The cleaner opened the door with the easy smile of someone who had been expecting a local. He was not expecting what he saw. He was not expecting someone who looked at him with the specific knowledge of exactly what he was and why he was there. Kale said he knew who sent him. He said he knew what he had been sent to do. He said none of it was going to happen, and that the court should be told so directly. The cleaner's hand moved toward his boot. Kale looked at his hand with an expression that made the hand stop. It was not a threatening expression. It was the expression of someone watching a child reach towards something they have already decided the child will not touch. He told the cleaner that the provincial investigation had already expanded east. He told him that 3 villages were now documented, with families willing to testify. He told him that a 4th was being verified and would likely be added before the week was out. He told him that the court could send as many cleaners as it liked and the documentation would survive them. He told him to go back and explain this clearly. He said it the way you say something to someone who is going to repeat it exactly. The cleaner stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he asked who Kale was. Kale thought about this for a moment. He said he was someone the court had already paid for. He said to remind them of that when he delivered the message. The cleaner left the following morning before sunrise. He did not complete his assignment. He also did not send any correspondence back to the court. He simply rode east and did not return. The Demon King's court was ancient and it was patient and it was very good at reading situations. The sudden silence from this particular village, combined with the provincial investigation's expansion, told it something. What it told it was that an operation that had run cleanly for 6 years had become visible. Visible operations were not useful operations. The court began the process of quietly closing its arrangements with the affected villages. It did this efficiently, without drama, the way you close a door you no longer need. It sent formal letters to the provincial authority acknowledging certain irregularities and expressing willingness to cooperate. This was unexpected. It was also calculated cooperation on the smaller thing to protect the larger architecture. Sarah received the cooperation letters and sat with them for a long time. She had spent 3 weeks traveling east and had found not 3 additional villages but 5. 5 villages, 7 individuals, dating back 11 years. She sent Kale a letter addressed to the fence mender at the eastern farm. It contained 1 line. She asked if he had expected this many. He wrote back 1 line. He said he had expected more. The village itself was changing in the slow way that villages change after they learn something about themselves. Some people were angry. Some people were sad. Some people were doing the specific work of revising their memory of the elder into something they could live with. Daro's mother had become, quietly, someone people visited. Not to apologize exactly, but to sit with, which was a different and possibly more honest thing. The farmer Kale worked for had started asking him questions in the evenings. Not about the investigation, not about the elder. About the fence mender himself, where he had come from, where he intended to go. Kale answered most of the questions vaguely and one of them honestly. The farmer asked if he planned to stay. Kale said he didn't know yet. He said there was still something he was working out. The farmer nodded and didn't ask what it was. He was the kind of man who understood that some work took the time it took. Kale had been thinking about the Demon King since the night he woke up at the base of the altar. Not constantly, not obsessively, but the way you think about a problem you have decided to eventually solve. The court's cooperation with the provincial authority was useful, but it was not the thing. The thing was that the Demon King still existed, still ran the same architecture, in other provinces. The arrangement this court had with this corridor of villages was one branch of something much larger. Cutting the branch didn't end the tree. He had spent months becoming someone who could walk into a room and make a cleaner stop moving. He had spent months learning that patience was more powerful than urgency. He had also spent months understanding that what the Demon King had put into him was not a gift. It was evidence. The Demon King had taken something from him. His life, his power, his future. He had taken it and used it to add to his own enormity. What Kale carried now was the residue of that, the part that hadn't been fully absorbed. Which meant the Demon King was, in a specific and technical sense, slightly less than he had been. And Kale was, in the same technical sense, carrying something that belonged to the Demon King's own architecture. He thought about this the way you think about a key. He thought about what doors a key like that might open. He left the shepherd's hut on a morning in early winter. He left everything in it exactly as it was, which was a way of saying he might come back. He walked to the eastern farm and told the farmer he was leaving for a while. The farmer asked how long. He said he didn't know. The farmer looked at him for a moment and then went inside and came back with a wrapped bundle of food. He handed it over without ceremony and went back to his work. Kale stood in the farmyard for a moment, holding the food. He was not used to people doing things like that. He had been the person who held the pass and got offered to the altar. He had not expected to become someone a farmer packed food for. He walked east on the same road the court riders used. He passed the point where he had turned back when following the rider. He kept walking. The forest at the province's eastern boundary was old and dense and had the quality of something that had been watching for a long time. He walked through it without slowing. On the other side was the beginning of the Demon King's territory. He stood at the boundary for a moment and felt the weight of the place ahead. He felt the Demon King's architecture in the land itself, the same way he felt the elder's heartbeat. He felt, also, the small familiar weight of what the Demon King had put in him at the altar. It responded to the territory the way a compass responds to north. He understood then what the thing in the darkness had meant when it called him something worse. He was not worse in the way a stronger weapon is worse. He was worse in the way a map is worse than no map, when the map leads somewhere the cartographer didn't intend. He walked into the territory. He did not look back. He had time, and he had the Demon King's own power inside him pointing the way, and he had learned the most important thing there was to learn. That the people who had fed him to the altar had been afraid of him. And they had been right to be. The territory felt different the moment he crossed the boundary. Not dangerous exactly, more like pressure, the ambient weight of something very large being very aware. The trees were the same trees, the road was the same road, but the air had a quality he could only describe as occupied. He walked for 2 hours before he saw anyone. A boy, 12 or 13, leading a goat along the road's edge. The boy looked at him the way people in this territory apparently looked at strangers. Carefully, from a distance, with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned that strangers meant something here. Kale nodded and kept walking. The boy watched him pass and then watched him for a long time after. The first village inside the territory was called Marin, and it was nothing like his own. It was orderly in the way that places are orderly when order has been enforced rather than chosen. The buildings were well maintained, the streets were clean, and no one met his eyes. He found the inn and took a room and sat on the bed and listened to the village. He could feel the Demon King's presence here the way he could feel weather, everywhere, directionless, impossible to ignore. He could also feel the specific weight of the power the altar had put in him responding to it. Recognizing. He stayed 3 days in Marin and learned what he could. The villages in the territory paid tribute, which was how the Demon King described it. The tribute was not gold or grain. It was labor, time, the specific yielding of autonomy that made a place manageable from a distance. Every village had a liaison appointed by the court, not quite an elder, not quite a soldier. Something in between, someone whose job was compliance and whose reward was safety. The liaisons were not evil people, which was the complicated part. Most of them were practical people who had decided that working within the system was better than being crushed by it. Some of them were genuinely trying to protect their villages within the constraints they had been given. Some of them had forgotten the constraints were constraints. Kale watched the Marin liaison for 2 days without introducing himself. He was a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with the tired eyes of someone who had been managing an impossible situation for too long. He handled disputes fairly, processed tribute paperwork without visible enthusiasm, and drank alone in the evenings. He was not the problem. He was a symptom of the problem. On the 3rd day Kale left Marin and continued east. The Demon King's court operated from a city called Veth, 3 days east of Marin. He had not learned this from anyone in the territory. He had learned it from the power the altar had given him, which knew the territory's architecture the way blood knows the body. Veth was large, walled, and visible from the low hills 2 hours before you reached it. He stood on a hill looking at it for a long time. He was not afraid, which he noted as information about himself. He had been afraid at the altar, briefly, before he understood that fear was not going to be useful. He had not been afraid since. He walked down the hill and joined the road into the city. There were guards at the gate, formal and professional, checking travelers with the efficiency of people who had done it 10,000 times. They looked at him the same way everyone in the territory looked at strangers. He felt them noticing that something about him was not quite right. He felt them deciding not to examine that feeling closely. He walked through the gate and into Veth. The city was not what he expected. He had built a version of it in his mind from the court letters and the rider's manner and the general atmosphere of the territory. He had imagined something dark, something that announced its nature visibly. It was not dark. It was a city, busy and functional and full of people going about their lives. The court operated from a large complex in the northern quarter, visible but not dominating. The Demon King himself was not visible at all. He understood, within a few hours of walking the streets, that this was intentional. The Demon King's power was most effective when it was ambient rather than present. When you couldn't point to it but couldn't deny it. When it was in the architecture rather than the room. He found a room in a boarding house near the market district and spent 4 days simply watching. He watched how the city moved, who had authority, how the court communicated with the population. He was building a map. Not of the streets. Of the relationships. The court had 3 tiers, which he identified from observation rather than documentation. The outer tier handled correspondence, tribute management, and the liaison network across the territory. The middle tier handled security, enforcement, and the kind of problem the cleaner had been sent to fix. The inner tier was something he could feel but not yet see. It was where the Demon King's actual decisions were made. He was not ready for the inner tier. He started with the outer. The outer tier was staffed by people who were, in the main, doing administrative work. They processed paperwork, managed records, handled the correspondence that kept 200 villages compliant. They were not monsters. They were bureaucrats who had normalized the system they worked within. He found one of them at a tavern near the court complex on his 5th evening in Veth. Her name was Mira and she was a junior records clerk who had been complaining to her colleague about a filing discrepancy. He sat one table over and listened. The discrepancy was small. A village in the western corridor had submitted tribute but the acknowledgement had not been processed. It was a minor thing, a bureaucratic error, meaningless in isolation. He understood immediately that it was not meaningless to him. The records of the outer tier were kept in a building adjacent to the main court complex. He knew this because Mira had mentioned it and because the power in him could feel it. The records contained 11 years of correspondence, tribute logs, and arrangement documentation, including the arrangements with the villages his village had been part of, including names, dates, amounts, and the identities of every liaison who had participated. He needed access to those records. Not to take them, that would be noticed immediately. To read them. To understand the full shape of what the Demon King had built and where its weight was distributed. He spent 3 days finding the answer to a simple question. How did the records building receive its supply deliveries? The answer was every Tuesday morning from a merchant quarter supplier through the building's side entrance. He arranged to be the person making the delivery on the following Tuesday. It took him 2 days to make the arrangement, which he did through 3 separate intermediaries. He paid in coin that he had, for the first time in months, worked for rather than found or created. It felt important to do it that way. Tuesday came and he carried boxes through the side entrance of the records building. He was wearing the delivery merchant's colors and moving with the purposeful invisibility of someone doing a routine job. No one looked at him. He delivered the boxes to the correct room and spent 40 minutes doing additional deliveries that did not exist. In those 40 minutes he read 11 years of records. Not physically, not page by page. He stood in the records room and felt the information the way he felt heartbeats. Distributed, ambient, total. It was not comfortable. 11 years of systematic extraction from 200 villages across 3 provinces. Names he didn't know attached to deaths he hadn't witnessed. A pattern so consistent it had its own internal logic, its own efficiencies, its own vocabulary. He stood in the records room until he had the full shape of it. Then he carried his empty boxes back through the side entrance and walked to the boarding house. He sat on the bed and did not move for a long time. He was not processing grief. He was processing scale. The scope of what the Demon King had built was significantly larger than he had understood from outside it. He adjusted his thinking accordingly. He spent 2 more weeks in Veth before attempting anything with the inner tier. He used the time to understand which people in the middle tier made which decisions. He used the time to identify which of the outer tier bureaucrats were performing compliance and which had chosen it. He used the time to understand how the Demon King communicated his will without being present. The answer was through precedent. The court ran on accumulated decisions so thoroughly documented that the Demon King barely needed to intervene. The system ran itself. Which meant that the system's vulnerability was not the Demon King. The Demon King was the founder, not the engine. The engine was the precedent. The records he had read. The 11 years of documented decisions that every tier used as reference for every new situation. If the precedent changed, the decisions would change. If the records reflected a different history, the system would follow that history. This was not a new idea. It was, in fact, exactly what the Elder had done when he changed the council vote record. The difference was scale. The difference was that he was not going to change the records to hide something. He was going to change them to reveal something. He encountered the Demon King for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in the court complex's eastern courtyard. Not deliberately, he had not arranged it and had not expected it. He had been passing through the courtyard as part of his ongoing work of being someone ordinary in a place he was not. The Demon King was simply there, which was unusual enough that the entire courtyard had reconfigured itself around the fact. People had found reasons to be elsewhere without appearing to leave. He was smaller than Kale remembered from the altar. Or rather, he was the same size, but the altar had added a dimension that was absent in ordinary daylight. Here he looked like a very old man in formal court clothes. Very old and very still, and carrying the specific weight of something that had not been young for a long time. He looked at Kale. Kale looked at him. Something passed between them that had no name in any language Kale knew. Recognition, maybe, but not the recognition of faces. The recognition of architecture. The Demon King knew what was inside Kale because it was his. Kale knew what was inside the Demon King because he was carrying part of it. They stood like that for approximately 4 seconds. Then the Demon King continued walking, and Kale continued walking, and the courtyard slowly refilled. He went back to the boarding house and sat with what had just happened. The Demon King had recognized him and had kept walking. There were 2 explanations for this. The first was that he didn't consider Kale a threat. The second was that he was curious what Kale would do next. He decided to act as though it was the second. He sent 3 letters on the same morning from 3 separate locations in the city. The first went to Sarah at the provincial authority. It contained a summary of the records he had read, not copies, but a precise description of where the originals were located and what they contained. He described the building, the room, the filing system, and the specific documents that would constitute proof of the pattern across all 3 provinces. The second letter went to the provincial authorities' central office in the capital. It was addressed to the senior investigator and contained the same information, worded more formally. The third letter went to the court itself. It was addressed to the inner tier, specifically, and it contained 1 sentence. It said that the records in the outer tier's archive were going to be read by people with the authority to act on what they found, and that this was already in motion. He signed this one with his name. His actual name. The court writer who received the third letter read it twice and immediately took it upstairs. He did not know why the name felt significant. The inner tier did. The Demon King's response was not what he expected. He expected pressure, enforcement, the kind of institutional weight that courts use when they feel threatened. What arrived instead was an invitation. A formal, correctly worded, impeccably courteous invitation to meet with a senior member of the inner tier. He read it 3 times and then accepted. The meeting was in a room in the northern quarter of the court complex. Plain furniture, good light, no guards visible. The senior inner tier member was a woman in her 60s, calm and precise and carrying the specific patience of someone who had managed complex situations for decades. She did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. She said the court was aware that certain historical practices had created significant exposure. She said the court was prepared to discuss a structured resolution. He said he was not there to negotiate. She said she knew that and asked what he was there for. He said he was there to make clear what was going to happen regardless of what the court decided. He told her the provincial authority already had the location of the records. He told her the investigation had 5 provinces now, not 3. He told her the pattern was documented well enough that individual cooperation was no longer required to prove it. She listened to all of this without changing expression. Then she asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted the system to stop. Not this corridor, not these villages. All of it. She was quiet for a long moment. She said that was not a small thing. He said he knew. He left the court complex and walked back through Veth. The city was the same city it had been when he arrived. Busy, functional, full of people going about their lives. He understood now that this was not a contradiction. A system this embedded in the architecture of a territory did not announce itself. It ran underneath everything, in the precedent, in the compliance, in the accumulated decisions of people who had stopped asking certain questions. He had spent 3 months as a fence-mender learning how that worked at village scale. He had spent 3 weeks in Veth learning how it worked at territory scale. The scale was different. The mechanism was identical. He went back to the boarding house and wrote a long letter to Sarah. Not about records or evidence or jurisdictions. About the mechanism. About how the system maintained itself through normalized compliance rather than active enforcement. About how the same thing that made the elder possible made the court possible. About what it would actually take to interrupt it at a level that mattered. He wrote for a long time. When he finished, it was dark outside and his hand was tired. He folded the letter and held it for a moment. He was not sure Sarah would understand all of it. He was fairly sure she would understand enough. He left Veth 4 days after the meeting. He walked back through the territory the same way he had come, on the same road, past the same boundary. He did not feel the pressure lift when he crossed back into the province. He had expected it to lift. It didn't. He understood that this was because the pressure was not territorial. It was structural. It lived in the same place the elders' logic had lived, in the same place the council vote had lived. In the part of people that decided some lives were acceptable currency. He walked back through the forest and out onto the provincial road. He walked for 2 days. He did not go back to the shepherd's hut. He did not go back to the eastern farm. He walked to the village and arrived on a Tuesday morning. The market was running. The square was full. He walked through it. People noticed him the way people notice someone familiar that they can't quite place. Some of them looked longer than others. One woman near the grain stall went very still and watched him walk past with her hand over her mouth. He walked to the center of the square and stopped. He stood where the altar had been, before they dismantled it after the investigation. He stood there for a moment and felt the village around him. Every heartbeat, every breath, the specific rhythm of a community that had learned something terrible about itself and was still deciding what to do with the knowledge. He was not angry at them. He had not been angry at them for a long time. He was something more patient than angry and more permanent than forgiveness. He was simply there, in the place where they had decided he was expendable, alive and returned and carrying something they had not intended to send back with him. He stood in the square for a long moment. Then he walked out of the village on the northern road. He had more places to be. He had a map now and patience, and the Demon King's own power pointing the way forward. And the people who had fed him to the altar had been afraid of what he was. They had been right. They had simply been wrong about whether being afraid of it would help.